Sarah Collins wasn't the kind of woman you'd expect to catch the eye of a billionaire CEO. She wasn't polished, refined, or even remotely close to the image of a high society woman in her tailored suits and perfectly pressed skirts. No, Sarah was different. She was a walking disaster. She was the kind of woman who could trip over a flat surface and spill coffee on the most important document in the room. But what no one knew was that beneath that messy exterior was a woman who dreamed of something more. A life that wasn't bound by the chaos she always seemed to create. A life that wasn't stuck in a constant cycle of mistakes and clumsy accidents. That morning. Like every other morning, Sarah had her routine. Running late. Juggling multiple things at once and trying to hold herself together. But on this particular day, everything that could go wrong did. As she dashed down the sidewalk toward the building that housed Pierce Industries, her phone buzzed wildly in her hand. She glanced down and saw a series of frantic texts from her friend Megan. Texts that were so frantic they felt like a countdown to some kind of disaster. "Sarah, you're running out of time. Get here ASAP. I need you to nail this." Sarah could almost feel the anxiety seeping through Megan's words. She was supposed to meet her for an interview, one that she'd barely had time to prepare for, let alone dress for. Her skirt was a bit too tight. Her shirt had a stain on it, and she wasn't even sure if her hair was doing its own thing or if she was somehow managing to make it look like a bird's nest. But none of that seemed to matter right now. What mattered was that she had to get there before the clock ran out. She tried to type back a quick response, but the words were all jumbled, and autocorrect turned her message into something so nonsensical it was impossible to even recognize. She gave up and shoved her phone back into her bag, making a mental note to just survive first, explain later. When she saw the gleaming skyscraper of Pierce Industries in the distance, Sarah's heart skipped. A beat. She made it. She was almost there. But just as she was about to step onto the sidewalk leading to the entrance, she caught a glimpse of herself in the building's glass door. Her eyes widened in horror. No. No. The zipper of her dress was in the front, not the back. The tag, which was supposed to be hidden, was sticking out of her chest like a neon sign begging for attention. How had she missed that? In her rush to fix it, she twisted and turned, her dress somehow twisting along with her. She tried pulling at the fabric, desperately yanking at the tag with her teeth, all while cursing under her breath. "I should have worn jeans," she muttered. "Who invented these ridiculous tags? They should be arrested." She was a walking disaster. But somehow Sarah had come to accept that about herself. Her entire life had been a string of failed attempts, embarrassing moments, and small disasters. It wasn't so much that she lacked the ability to succeed. It was more like the universe had a personal vendetta against her. Or maybe it was just that she was doomed to mess things up in the most public, embarrassing way possible. Either way, she couldn't help but laugh at her own misfortune. She finally fixed the tag with a bobby pin, creating a look that was something between avant-garde and a last-minute DIY project. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. She sighed and pushed through the revolving doors of the building, only to be immediately hit by the cold, unrelenting air of the polished lobby. Everything in the room looked pristine. Perfect. The marble floors seemed to gleam under the harsh fluorescent lights. The receptionist's perfectly pressed suit made Sarah feel like she had stumbled into an episode of Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. And Sarah? Well, she felt like she had walked in from a completely different world, a world where she barely managed to keep it together long enough to make it through the day. "Hi, good morning," she said with a weak smile, trying her best to look as though she belonged. "I'm here for the assistant interview." The receptionist didn't even look up. She just pointed to the elevator with an indifferent flick of her hand. Sarah couldn't help but feel the sting of that unspoken judgment. She wasn't one of them. She wasn't a perfectly groomed businesswoman. She was just the girl who always seemed to mess up. But she would try. She always tried. As Sarah stepped into the elevator, she took a deep breath, trying to gather herself. She couldn't help but glance at her reflection in the polished chrome. It was a small moment of vanity, perhaps, but she needed a tiny bit of reassurance that she wasn't in fact the disaster she felt like. And then it happened. The doors opened and she walked straight into him. Alex Pierce, the CEO of Pierce Industries, stood before her, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his presence like a shadow that instantly filled the room. She didn't even see him coming. One moment she was stepping out of the elevator. The next she was colliding with him. Coffee splashing all over his crisp white shirt, the hot liquid turning into a brown waterfall that soaked him from head to toe. Crap. Sarah exclaimed, her heart dropping to her stomach as she watched the coffee stain his pristine shirt. She froze, horrified. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Let me pay for the dry cleaning. I'll take care of it." Alex blinked in disbelief, looking down at the ruined shirt and then back up at her. His expression was unreadable. $20, he said flatly, his brow arching. "Do you think $20 will cover the situation?" Sarah scrambled for her purse, yanking out the first crumpled bill she found and thrusting it toward him. But the moment she saw his face, the horror of the situation hit her in full force. There was no way she could fix this. Not with money, not with words. And then in the middle of her embarrassment, she heard a slight chuckle. Alex wasn't angry. In fact, he seemed to find her predicament utterly amusing. "Are you trying to bribe me with $20? He asked, his lips curling into the faintest smile. Sarah stared at him, bewildered. "I'm just trying to get to my interview," she mumbled, still flustered. "I'm applying for the assistant position." "Good luck," Alex said, his smile broadening, his eyes gleaming with amusement. He stepped aside, giving her an almost mocking salute. "You'll need it." In that moment, Sarah had no idea who Alex Pierce was. She had no clue that this awkward, embarrassing encounter would change her life in ways she could never have predicted. The CEO, with his sharp business instincts and perfect life, would never take someone like her seriously. But as she walked into that interview room, already convinced she had no chance, she couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, just somehow, this might not be as hopeless as it seemed. The door to her new future had opened, but she didn't know that yet. She didn't know that Alex Pierce was about to become far more than just the rich CEO who had been the object of her humiliation. He was about to become the man who would change her life in every imaginable way. Because in the chaos of her world, something unexpected was about to happen. The following days were nothing short of a whirlwind. Sarah Collins had never been one to shy away from chaos. It was almost as if it had a magnetic pull on her, drawing her into the kind of messy situations that would make even the most seasoned professional cringe. But now, in this world of sharp suits, polished boardrooms, and immaculate presentations, she found herself in a place that seemed entirely foreign. She was trying to do the impossible, fit into a world where everything was measured, calculated, and organized. A world where she had always felt like a stranger, a woman who had more accidents than achievements to her name. And yet, she was here. She had made it past the disastrous coffee spill with Alex Pierce, the billionaire CEO of Pierce Industries, and somehow found herself working at his company, though the idea that she actually belonged here seemed laughable to her. When she stepped into her new office, the reality of her situation hit her. The office building was stunning. Sleek glass windows that stretched into the sky, minimalist decor that screamed high-end, and employees who were the epitome of professionalism. Everything about it screamed perfection. Everything but her. Sarah's attempts to blend in felt like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. As she sat at her desk, the once familiar chaos that had been her daily life seemed almost out of place. There she was amidst pristine folders, well-organized documents, and a computer screen that seemed too serious for her to touch without messing it up. She had been hired for an assistant position, yes, but she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up this charade. Her clumsiness was practically built into her DNA. The way she knocked over coffee mugs, the way she managed to delete files she didn't even know existed, and how she couldn't even send a simple email without accidentally hitting reply all instead of reply. But here she was trying. Every day she tried. It didn't help that every interaction with Alex Pierce made her feel even more out of place. He was everything she wasn't. He was confident, poised, and in control at all times. Alex had a presence that filled up the room, a gaze that made people stop in their tracks. She couldn't even look him in the eye without feeling like she was under a microscope, like everything she did was being scrutinized. He was so different from her in every way, and yet there was something about him that intrigued her. Maybe it was his sharp wit, or perhaps it was the way he could effortlessly balance the icy exterior of a businessman with flashes of genuine laughter when he saw the world as she did, a world full of imperfections, mistakes, and the occasional, ridiculous mishap. Sarah tried her best to focus on the work at hand, but it was nearly impossible with everything that kept happening. One day, she tried to make a simple phone call to a client. Simple, she thought. But of course, her nerves got the better of her, and instead of speaking fluently, she blurted out a mixture of English and Spanish that made her sound like a character straight out of a soap opera. She hung up mortified, but when she looked at Alex for some sort of guidance, she saw him stifling a grin. Instead of reprimanding her, he simply shook his head and said, I never know what's going to happen when you're around. Sarah had no idea what he meant by that, but somehow it made her feel better. She wasn't perfect, but Alex didn't seem to mind. He didn't expect her to be flawless. That was a strange feeling for her, one she wasn't used to. All her life she had been told to fix herself, to tidy up her mess, to make things right. But with Alex it felt different. He seemed to appreciate her for who she was. The chaotic, clumsy, unpredictable Sarah who had a talent for turning mundane moments into full-on disasters. But there were times, like in the elevator, when she could feel something unspoken between them. It wasn't the kind of thing you could point to and label. It wasn't a crush or anything overtly romantic. It was just this tension. The kind that bubbles under the surface, growing stronger without either of them saying a word. It wasn't. Until one afternoon, during a particularly disastrous meeting with a client, that she started to notice it. The meeting had gone terribly wrong. Sarah had spilled water all over a pile of important documents, and to make matters worse, her phone had rung at the worst possible moment, blaring some off-key rendition of Happy Birthday that could only be described as a disaster in musical form. She had muttered apologies under her breath, but it was clear that the client was less than impressed. As she sat there trying to salvage what little dignity she had left, she caught Alex's eye. Instead of the icy business-as-usual look she had become accustomed to, there was something different in his gaze. Amusement, maybe? Or was it something else? For a moment, it felt like she was looking into a different side of him, one that wasn't so detached from the world around him. She saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of her messiness. But it wasn't judgment. It was acceptance. He didn't see her as someone who needed to be fixed, but as someone who could make things interesting, even when everything was falling apart. In the days that followed, their relationship started to shift. It wasn't immediately noticeable, but Sarah began to realize that her presence in the office was changing something in Alex. She wasn't sure what it was, but there was an undeniable shift. At first, she thought it was all in her head. After all, she was the same clumsy woman who couldn't get through a day without embarrassing herself. But she noticed it in the way Alex would glance at her, the way his eyes lingered a little, longer than necessary. She noticed it when he started seeking her out more, asking for her help with things, even though she wasn't exactly the most competent assistant in the building. It wasn't just about work anymore. Somehow she had slipped, past the professional facade and into his personal world. It was unsettling at first, but also strangely comforting. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt like she was allowed to just be herself. She didn't have to pretend to be perfect or to fit into a mold that wasn't hers. Alex didn't expect her to be something she wasn't. And that in itself was a gift she never expected to find in this cold corporate world. But there was still a part of Sarah that couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. She was never going to fit in with the other employees at Pierce Industries, those flawless, poised professionals who could talk business and make decisions without missing a beat. She wasn't like them. She had always been the one who fumbled through life, the one who couldn't keep her balance, the one who couldn't even make a simple phone call without embarrassing herself. But with Alex, she felt something different, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was more to her than just the chaos she had always known. It wasn't long before she realized that Alex Pierce wasn't just some untouchable billionaire, CEO. He wasn't just the man who ran a multi-million-dollar company. He was someone who saw the world differently, someone who wasn't afraid to let go of the perfection everyone else clung to. And maybe, just maybe, Sarah had something to offer him that no one else could. A sense of freedom, a sense of unpredictability, and a reminder that life wasn't always about being perfect. Sometimes it was about embracing the mess and finding joy in the chaos. But as their relationship continued to evolve, Sarah couldn't help but wonder where it was all leading. She wasn't just an assistant. She wasn't just the girl who spilled coffee or tripped over her own feet. And Alex, he wasn't just her boss. He was something more. Someone who had started to see her not for her mess, but for who she truly was. And that was a terrifying thought. What would happen when she couldn't hide behind the walls of chaos anymore? What would happen when their connection became something real? The answers were far from clear. But Sarah knew one thing for sure. This journey was only just beginning. And in a world where everything seemed to fall apart at the slightest touch, maybe that was exactly what she needed. A little chaos, a little unpredictability, and maybe, just maybe, a little love. The office had taken on a rhythm that Sarah Collins thought she could manage. For weeks, she navigated her chaotic reality within the perfectly crafted world of Pierce Industries, where each mistake, each awkward moment seemed magnified against the backdrop of sleek glass walls, polished floors, and impeccable employees. But for all the chaos that surrounded her, there was one constant: Alex Pierce, the man who had hired her despite every reason not to, and the man who seemed to be a quiet observer to the mayhem she created. She never thought she would find herself so immersed in his world. The first few days had been the usual dance of stumbling through paperwork, answering calls, and causing accidental disasters with the utmost grace, if grace could be measured, by how often she tripped over her own feet or misfiled confidential documents. But slowly something started to shift. It wasn't just that she was getting used to the pace of the office. It wasn't that she had learned how to juggle her responsibilities with some semblance of competence. It was Alex. At first, it had been simple curiosity. He was everything she wasn't: composed, charismatic, always in control. And yet there was something undeniably magnetic about him. It wasn't just his reputation or his wealth. It was something deeper. Maybe it was the rare moments she glimpsed beneath his steely exterior. There were glimpses, fleeting but undeniable, of something more. It wasn't love, at least not in any obvious form, but it was something neither of them could quite name. It was more than friendship, more than a simple professional relationship. It was the unspoken understanding that hovered between them, something that grew more complicated with each passing day. Sarah tried to focus on her work, to keep her thoughts from straying too far, but Alex had this ability to make her feel things she wasn't prepared to feel. He had an uncanny knack for knowing when she was on the verge of a disaster, stepping in just in time to avert catastrophe, not with reprimand, but with quiet amusement. She could almost hear his voice in her head every time she tried to figure out her next move. "You have no idea what's going to happen next, do you?" And she didn't. Not with him. She never had control over what happened when she was around him. One day, as Sarah attempted to tackle an urgent presentation, she found herself in yet another situation that bordered on chaos. The projector wouldn't work. The slides kept shifting on their own, and the client on the other end of the call sounded increasingly frustrated. Alex was supposed to be in a meeting on the other side of the building, but somehow he appeared at her office door, a silent figure in the doorway, as calm as ever. "Having a bit of trouble?" he asked, his tone a mixture of amusement and curiosity, though Sarah could hear the slight edge of concern beneath it. "Just a minor catastrophe," she said, her voice tight with embarrassment. She quickly moved to grab the remote, only to knock over a half-filled cup of coffee in the process. The warm liquid splashed across the desk, soaking her notepad and the presentation she had spent hours preparing. Alex didn't flinch. He didn't even look like he wanted to laugh, though she was sure the urge was there. Instead, he stepped forward, moving with a grace that made her feel more out of place than she already did. "Take a deep breath, Sarah," he said, his voice soft yet commanding. "We'll figure this out." His calmness was almost contagious, and for the first time, Sarah felt herself breathe easier, even in the middle of what could have been a career-ending moment. In a matter of minutes, Alex had repaired the projector and set the presentation back on track. He wasn't just a problem solver. There was something else in the way he carried himself. He was there for her in a way that no one else had ever been. He wasn't just looking at her as the assistant who made mistakes. He was looking at her as someone worth helping, worth understanding. When the presentation finally began, Sarah was still trying to recover from the disaster she'd just caused. But when she looked at Alex, standing there with his arms casually crossed, watching her, she realized something unexpected. It wasn't the first time she'd messed up in front of him. It wasn't even the first time she'd felt completely out of her element. But it was the first time she didn't feel as though he was judging her for it. In fact, she was starting to feel like maybe, just maybe, he was seeing her for who she really was, rather than as the disaster she often portrayed herself to be. As the weeks passed, this tension between them grew. It wasn't overt. They didn't openly acknowledge the spark that seemed to flicker whenever they were near each other. But it was there, lingering like a shadow just outside the corners of their interactions. Alex's eyes would linger a little longer than necessary, his lips curling up into that barely noticeable smile when she blundered through yet another impossible task. And each time, Sarah found herself smiling back, not in triumph, but in a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that was forming between them, unspoken but undeniable. But as much as Sarah tried to convince herself that nothing had changed, nothing could have been further from the truth. there was a shift in the way she began to see Alex. It wasn't just his calm demeanor or his sharp business acumen that caught her attention anymore. It was his kindness, the way he treated her when no one else was looking, the way he'd step in to help when she didn't even know she needed it. There were moments when Sarah would catch herself thinking about him outside of the office. When she passed by his office door and heard him talking with clients, she would wonder what it would be like to be on the other side of that desk, on the other side of that world. She never imagined she would be so drawn to someone so different from her. Someone who had everything she didn't and yet seemed to be offering her something she could never have imagined. Acceptance maybe, or maybe just the space to be herself. But this bond between them, this unspoken understanding, wasn't something Sarah had ever experienced. She was used to being the odd one out, the one who didn't quite fit, the one who was always in the way of someone else's perfect world. But Alex didn't seem to mind the way she stumbled through her day, the way she was never quite as polished as everyone else in the office. In fact, she began to realize that Alex seemed to appreciate her for it, not in spite of her flaws, but because of them. It was a strange new feeling, one she wasn't sure how to handle. And just when she thought things couldn't get any more complicated, they did. It happened when Sarah accidentally overheard a conversation between Alex and his assistant. She had walked into the break room to grab some coffee when she overheard his voice, low and almost conspiratorial. "Have you noticed how she's been lately?" Alex was asking Ethan, his voice tinged with something Sarah couldn't quite place. "I have," Ethan replied, his tone thoughtful. "It's like she's changing. Something's different about her." "I know," Alex said, his voice softer now. "I can't quite put my finger on it, but I think I like it." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. He likes it. Was he talking about her? Did Alex Pierce, the infamously stoic CEO, actually see something in her? Was she just the quirky assistant to him, or had she somehow become something more? She stood there, frozen in place, feeling a mixture of shock and something else, something warmer, something more vulnerable. She hadn't meant to overhear that conversation, but the words stuck with her as she walked back to her desk. She couldn't stop thinking about it. And what did it mean for her? What did it mean for them? From that moment on, everything changed. The distance that had once existed between her and Alex began to close, and she wasn't sure whether she was ready for it. She wasn't ready for the way he made her feel things she hadn't felt in a long time. Things that were as terrifying as they were exhilarating. There were moments when Alex would look at her, really look at her, and she would feel exposed as if he could see straight through her. She was used to hiding her insecurities, her doubts and her fears, but when he was near, it was as though they didn't matter anymore. But that wasn't all. For the first time in her life, Sarah began to see herself differently. She wasn't just the woman who tripped over her words or spilled coffee on important documents. She wasn't just the girl who seemed destined for chaos. She was someone who mattered. To him, at least. And that thought was enough to send her heart racing, in ways she couldn't explain. But with every new moment, the questions kept building. What did it all mean? Where was this connection between them leading? Was she just another distraction for him? Or was there something more? Would she find a place in his life beyond the assistant's desk, beyond the chaos she had come to embrace? As Sarah sat at her desk, the questions swirled in her mind, each one more confusing than the last. She didn't know the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep pretending she wasn't affected by what was happening between them. The lines between professional and personal were blurring, and she didn't know how to stop it. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to. For the first time, Sarah Collins felt as though she might finally be ready for something more than just chaos. And with Alex Pierce's eyes watching her, she wasn't sure if she was ready to find out what that something was. The conference room was vast. It was quiet in a way that only high-powered boardrooms could be, with its polished mahogany table gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The glass windows offered a view of the entire city, its towering skyline reflecting the corporate world's promise of success. But to Sarah, sitting at the far end of that table, it all felt like an illusion, a facade meant to hide the chaos that lurked just beneath the surface. Today was no different than any other day. Another high-stakes meeting, another one of those moments where Sarah found herself wondering just how long it would take for her to finally mess up and bring everything crashing down around her. It wasn't that she didn't know how to do her job, she did. She had a long history of organizing, of navigating impossible situations with precision and stealth, even if it was often at the cost of her sanity. But this world she'd somehow been thrust into felt different. Sarah had never been in a place like this before. Everything was so perfect, so controlled. And then there was Alex. Ever since he had stepped into her life, this cold, calculating CEO with his immaculate appearance and unshakable poise, she had felt like an imposter in his world. What could someone like her, clumsy, unpredictable, and unpolished, possibly bring to a place like this? Despite the growing connection between them, Sarah still wasn't sure what to make of Alex. She had been trying to decipher him, to understand the layers that made him the enigma he was. But each time she thought she had him figured out, he would throw her another curveball. He had this way of making her feel like she was the most important person in the room, even when she was drowning in a sea of business jargon and corporate strategies. And that, more than anything, had kept her up at night wondering why. Why? Her? Why had he noticed her? And most importantly, why hadn't he pushed her out of his life the way she expected? In that conference room, the walls seemed to close in on her as the conversation continued. Everyone was talking at once, analyzing numbers, discussing projections, making decisions that could make or break the company. It was also sterile. And all Sarah could think about was how out of place she felt, how she would rather be anywhere else but here, trying to balance the glass of water in front of her without spilling it all over the floor. Alex was there too, of course. His presence was as commanding as ever. He sat at the head of the table, his sharp eyes scanning the room, absorbing every word spoken, processing the information like a machine. The power in his posture was palpable, calm, calculated, and untouchable. He was everything Sarah wasn't. He was control embodied, and she was chaos wrapped in a well-meaning disguise. But for all the distance he put between himself and everyone else in the room, Sarah couldn't help but notice that his gaze would occasionally drift toward her. It was subtle, but it was there. And every time it happened, a strange feeling would ripple through her. Part confusion, part exhilaration, and part fear. What did it mean? Did he see her as just the assistant, the one who could barely keep her professional composure in check? Or was there something else in his gaze that suggested he saw something in her that no one else did? The tension between them had become palpable in the last few weeks, more so than ever before. She couldn't escape the way his presence made her feel, like she was a magnet being pulled towards something dangerous, something she couldn't quite control. And as much as she wanted to ignore the way her heart raced whenever their eyes met, she knew deep down that she couldn't. The boundaries between them, once so clear, were starting to blur, and it terrified her. She wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever this connection between them was becoming. The meeting rumbled on, the voices around her growing louder, the numbers and strategies flying like a whirlwind of corporate speak. But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She couldn't. Her thoughts were consumed with the man sitting across from her, his sharp profile illuminated by the overhead lights, his features a study in precision and control. His hands, steady as ever, were steepled in front of him as he took notes, as if everything in his life was perfectly ordered. Alex Pierce was used to control. He thrived on it. And for the first time in her life, Sarah realized that she wanted that same control. She wanted to be the one in the driver's seat, the one who could navigate the chaos with the same ease he did. But she wasn't like him. She couldn't pretend to be. For a moment, her gaze lingered on him, wondering how someone could remain so untouched by the madness of the world around them. But that thought was fleeting, replaced by the sudden realization that the tension in the room wasn't just about the numbers. It wasn't just about the business. It was about something much more personal. She could feel it in the way Alex's eyes flickered to her one last time before the meeting wrapped up, as if something unspoken was passing between them. When the meeting finally adjourned, Sarah was the last to leave the room. She gathered her things quickly, hoping to escape the suffocating feeling that had settled over her. But before she could slip out, Alex's voice stopped her. "Sarah," he said, his tone a bit more subdued than usual. "Can you stay for a minute?" Her heart skipped a beat. She turned slowly, not sure what to expect. Was this the moment? Was he going to tell her what he really thought? The thought of having him finally say something, anything, made her stomach twist in knots. "Of course," she replied, trying to steady her voice. The rest of the room emptied, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet space. The air between them felt thick with anticipation, as if something was about to break, something that had been building for weeks, maybe even months. Sarah took a deep breath and stood there waiting for Alex to speak. "Are you all right?" Alex asked, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. "I know these meetings can be overwhelming." Sarah blinked, surprised by the softness in his voice. The way he asked the question with such care made her feel something she hadn't expected. It was the last thing she thought she'd ever hear from someone like him. "I'm fine," she said quickly, her voice betraying the lie. She wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine in a long time, but she couldn't let him know that. She couldn't show him that she was struggling, that she wasn't cut out for this world he had thrust her into. Alex watched her closely, his gaze never wavering. He didn't say anything for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. "Sarah," he began again, his voice softer this time, almost hesitant. "I know you're trying to keep it together, but you don't have to do it alone." The words hit her like a wave. They weren't the words of a boss to his assistant. They were the words of someone who saw her for who she truly was, someone who understood that beneath her clumsy exterior was someone capable of so much more. "You've been doing a great job," Alex continued, stepping closer to her. "But if you ever need help, if you ever need someone to lean on, I'm here." For the briefest of moments, Sarah felt something shift inside of her. It wasn't just the relief of hearing those words. It was something deeper. It was the realization that maybe, just maybe, Alex Pierce saw something in her that no one else did. Maybe he wasn't the cold, distant CEO she had imagined. Maybe he was someone more. Someone who had his own walls built up for reasons she couldn't yet understand. Her heart pounded in her chest as she met his gaze, not knowing what to say. What could she say? Was this the moment when everything would change? Or was it just another fleeting moment of connection that would slip away, leaving them both back where they started? "Aye," she began, her voice barely a whisper. But before she could finish, Alex stepped forward and gently placed a hand on her arm. The touch was warm, reassuring, and yet it sent a shockwave of electricity through her. It wasn't the kind of touch she had expected from him. It was something softer, something more intimate, as if he was reaching out to her in a way that felt completely natural. "You don't have to say anything," Alex said, his voice low. "I just want you to know that I'm here." And just like that, the tension between them seemed to evaporate. The walls that had once felt so insurmountable now seemed so much smaller. Maybe they were still two different people from different worlds, but in that moment they were more connected than they had ever been. And as Sarah looked into Alex's eyes, she realized something that both scared and exhilarated her. She wasn't just falling for the idea of him. She was falling for him, the man beneath the carefully constructed layers, the one who saw her not as a mistake, but as someone worth noticing. For the first time, she didn't feel like the odd one out. She felt like she belonged, if only for this brief, quiet moment. But as much as she tried to convince herself that it wasn't real, she knew deep down that it was. The line between chaos and control had blurred, and there was no going back. Now, the days following that conversation had passed in a blur. Sarah couldn't escape the feeling of being caught in some kind of dream, one where nothing was as it seemed, and where her life had suddenly been thrust into an entirely different realm. Every time she walked into Smith Global, she felt the weight of her own contradictions. On one hand, she was the assistant, the one who couldn't even walk without tripping over her own feet. On the other, she was someone who had caught the eye of the CEO, Alex Pierce. And that, more than anything, scared her. It scared her because she didn't know how to reconcile the two. There were moments when Sarah allowed herself to indulge in the fantasy, the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than an employer-employee relationship. She caught herself thinking about Alex at the most unexpected times, imagining his smile, his voice, the way he made her feel like she mattered. And yet, the more she allowed herself to entertain those thoughts, the more she felt the weight of the reality she was living in. The reality where she was the poor girl who had no place in his world. Sarah didn't belong here. She knew that. She had always known that. She wasn't cut from the same cloth as the sleek, polished employees that filled the hallways of Smith Global. And Alex, well, Alex was as distant as he was captivating. He was the kind of man who had everything at his fingertips, power, wealth, influence, and yet, despite his cold demeanor, there was a part of him that seemed to notice her. But why? Why her? It was an internal battle she couldn't escape. Was she being foolish to entertain the idea that someone like Alex could ever truly see her? Or was it possible, just possible, that beneath the walls he had built around himself there was something real? The events at the office had only heightened her confusion. Every glance from Alex made her stomach twist with both excitement and fear. She had tried to convince herself that it was nothing more than his usual aloofness. But it wasn't. She could feel it in the air, something unspoken, something that connected them in a way that was hard to define. Yet each time their paths crossed, she was left wondering, was he just being kind because she was his employee, or was he genuinely interested in her as a person? The thought made her dizzy. That night, after yet another exhausting day of trying to maintain her composure, Sarah found herself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every word, every glance. She had gotten so caught up in the idea of what could be that she couldn't see the reality of what was right in front of her. She had never been good at seeing things clearly, at distinguishing between her own desires and the actual truth. It had always been easier to live in the world she imagined rather than the one she actually inhabited. But that night, as the clock ticked away and the world outside her window went quiet, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging thought that Alex wasn't just her boss anymore. He had become something more, something that threatened to shake the foundations of everything she had built for herself. Her world, which had always been neatly ordered and predictable, had suddenly turned upside down, and she didn't know how to put the pieces back together. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself growing increasingly distant. The excitement of the initial connection with Alex was fading, replaced by a growing sense of fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of being caught up in something that she couldn't control. She had seen it happen before. People getting in over their heads, believing in things that weren't real, and ending up with nothing but heartache. And yet there were still those fleeting moments when she caught Alex looking at her in a way that made her heart race. Those moments were intoxicating, and they kept her coming back, even though she knew she shouldn't. It all came to a head one morning when Sarah was sitting at her desk, buried in paperwork, trying to focus on the task at hand. She had been doing her best to keep her distance, to maintain the professional boundaries that were necessary in a place like Smith Global. But it was getting harder, much harder. Alex appeared in the doorway of her office, his figure framed by the light from the hallway. His presence alone seemed to fill the room, and for a moment Sarah forgot to breathe. "Sarah," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of something else, something unspoken. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Her heart skipped a beat. She looked up at him, her mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. Was this it? Was this the moment where everything would change? Or was it just another one of those conversations, where she would walk away with nothing but confusion? "Of course," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady, though she knew he could hear the tremor in it. Alex stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, his movements deliberate, controlled. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if both were waiting for the other to break the silence, to make the first move. "Is everything all right?" he asked, finally breaking the tension. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. He couldn't possibly know how she was feeling. How could he? She had been trying so hard to keep her emotions buried beneath a layer of professionalism. But now, standing so close to him, everything felt raw, unguarded. "I'm fine," she said quickly, shaking her head. "Just busy." Alex didn't seem convinced. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "I don't think you are. I think you've been carrying a lot lately." His voice softened, his tone almost gentle. "You're not alone in this, Sarah. You never have to be." Her heart hammered in her chest. It wasn't the words that struck her most. It was the way he said them. With such sincerity. It was as if he saw through the facade she had built for herself. As if he understood exactly what was going on in her head, even when she didn't fully understand it herself. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what this is. I don't know what's real anymore." Alex's gaze softened, and for the first time Sarah saw something in his eyes that took her by surprise. Vulnerability. He wasn't just a cold, distant CEO. He was a person, someone with his own struggles, his own doubts. And in that moment, she realized that he was just as lost as she was. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," he said softly, his voice soothing. "We're all just figuring it out as we go along." Sarah's chest tightened, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had been so focused on the chaos in her own life that she hadn't stopped to consider that Alex might be going through something similar. Maybe he was just as uncertain about everything as she was. Maybe, just maybe, He wasn't the flawless, untouchable figure she had imagined him to be. For the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to be vulnerable, to let go of the walls she had built around herself. And as she did, something shifted between them. It wasn't just the physical proximity. It wasn't just the way his eyes held hers. It was something deeper, something that couldn't be explained in words. In that moment, Sarah realized that the struggle between reality and illusion wasn't something that could be avoided or controlled. It was something she had to embrace, to live with, to accept. She had never believed in fairy tales, never thought that she could be part of something bigger than herself. But standing here with Alex, she couldn't help but wonder if this was her story too, one that was still being written, one that was still unfolding. As the tension hung in the air, Alex reached out and gently touched her arm, a simple gesture that sent a jolt of electricity through her. "I'm here, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "Whatever happens, I'm here." And for the first time, in a long time, Sarah believed him. The air in the office felt different now, heavier yet inexplicably lighter all at once. Sarah couldn't escape the reality of what had happened. She had seen the cracks form, the barriers between them begin to collapse in the most unexpected way. Alex had always been so untouchable, so guarded. But the moment he had touched her arm, the moment his words had found a way past her defenses, everything changed. She tried to carry on with her work, to retreat into the safety of routine. But every corner of Smith Global seemed to be infused with the presence of Alex. It wasn't just the occasional glance from across the room or the way he lingered just a little too long in the doorway of her office. It was the invisible thread between them that had now been stretched taut. It felt like something electric, something undeniably real, but also something she wasn't sure she was ready for. The reality of their situation was far from simple, and Sarah couldn't ignore the whispers that followed her at every turn. Was she simply his employee? Or was this something more? The lines between truth and desire had blurred in ways she had never anticipated. Sarah had spent so much of her life trying to keep her heart at arm's length, trying to convince herself that emotions were a luxury she couldn't afford. But now, Alex had come into her life like a storm, unpredictable and powerful, shaking everything she thought she knew about herself, about what she wanted, and about the world she had built. There were mornings when Sarah woke up with a sense of dread, the weight of the unknown hanging over her like a storm cloud. How was she supposed to navigate this new reality? Was she just another chapter in Alex's story, a fleeting distraction that would be forgotten once the next shiny object came into his life? Or was there something deeper at play? It was an internal battle that wore on her every single day. On the one hand, there was a part of her that felt drawn to him, impossibly drawn. She couldn't ignore the way her heart raced when their eyes met, or the way his smile seemed to melt all her defenses. But on the other hand, she was a woman who knew her place. She knew that someone like Alex, someone with the world at his fingertips, would never truly see her, not in the way she wanted. He was the CEO, the master of his domain, and she was just Sarah, the assistant who was always a step behind. The tension between them was palpable, thick with longing but also soaked in doubt. Sarah found herself questioning every interaction, every word, every touch. She would replay their conversations in her mind over and over again, looking for hidden meanings, for clues as to what he really felt. And yet, the more she searched, the more she found herself lost in the labyrinth of her own emotions. It wasn't just the uncertainty of his feelings, it was the fear of her own. She didn't want to fall for someone like him. She didn't want to be vulnerable, didn't want to allow herself to be swept up in a world she didn't belong to. But Alex had a way of breaking through her walls, of showing her a side of herself she hadn't even known existed, and so she began to pull away. She started to distance herself from him, to try and regain control over her own emotions. It was easier that way. Safer too. She could maintain her distance, keep her professional facade intact, and avoid the inevitable heartbreak that would come if she let herself get too close. But the more she tried to shut him out, the more she realized it wasn't that simple. One evening, as Sarah was sitting in her small apartment, the weight of the day pressing down on her, she found herself thinking about him again. She had tried to forget, to push him out of her mind, but it was impossible. The thought of him, of the way he had looked at her, of the way he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years, kept invading her thoughts. She had never been one to believe in fairy tales or destiny, But now, in this strange and uncertain moment, she couldn't help but wonder if her life had suddenly become one. The next day, Sarah found herself in the office once again, her heart racing as she prepared for another day of navigating the maze of her emotions. As she sat at her desk, typing away at the endless pile of paperwork, she tried to focus on the task at hand. But the silence in the office was deafening. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on her, as though every corner of the room was filled with the unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings that neither she nor Alex dared to address. And then, just as she was about to lose herself in the rhythm of her work, he walked into her office. Alex. She had barely registered his presence before he spoke, his voice low and calm, yet carrying the weight of something she couldn't quite put her finger on. "Sarah," he said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" The words sent her heart into overdrive, and for a moment she couldn't find her breath. She had spent so many days hiding from him, burying herself in her work, in the chaos of the office, but now, in this moment, it was impossible to ignore the pull between them. "Of course," she said, her voice betraying her anxiety as she looked up at him, trying to maintain her composure. Alex stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet click that echoed through the space. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt thick with unspoken tension, heavy with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone softening, his eyes studying her with a kind of careful concern that sent a wave of warmth rushing through her. Sarah swallowed, trying to collect herself. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her voice was far from steady. "Just busy." But Alex wasn't convinced. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers, and there it was again. The same intensity, the same feeling that had begun to swirl between them from the very beginning. It wasn't just the usual professional distance that separated them anymore. It was something more, something that neither of them could ignore. "I don't think you are," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I think you've been carrying a lot lately." Sarah felt her chest tighten at his words. He was right. She had been carrying a lot, more than anyone could possibly know. But could she really share that with him? Could she really open up about the way she felt, about the uncertainty and the fear that had been building inside her since the day they first crossed paths? I don't know what to do," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I don't know what this is, what we are. I don't know what's real anymore." Alex's expression softened, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable, as though he understood exactly what she was going through. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "We're all just figuring it out as we go along." In that moment, everything seemed to shift. The walls Sarah had so carefully built around herself began to crumble piece by piece until there was nothing left but the raw truth of what she was feeling. She didn't have to have everything figured out. She didn't have to know where this was going or what it meant or whether it would end in heartbreak. All she had to do was let herself feel it, let herself be vulnerable, let herself admit that she was scared. And in that moment, as Alex reached out to gently touch her arm once more, Sarah realized something that she hadn't allowed herself to admit before. She didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to know what the future held. All she needed to do was trust the journey. Trust that the path they were walking together, however uncertain, was worth taking. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Alex smiled, his gaze softening. "You don't need to thank me," he said quietly. "I'm here, Sarah. Whatever happens, I'm here." And for the first time, Sarah believed him. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could navigate the unknown together. It had been a week since the proposal, since everything had changed in the blink of an eye. Sarah sat in her apartment, staring out the window, her mind still racing with the events that had unfolded. The world outside seemed the same, with the hum of traffic and the soft murmur of the city's endless pulse. But she knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same. Not for her, not for Alex. The days after the proposal had felt like a whirlwind. Each moment had been filled with a mixture of excitement, confusion, and a deep, aching longing. She had never imagined that her life would take such an unexpected turn. Sarah had always been someone who thrived on control, on keeping a distance between herself and the chaos that life often seemed to offer. But Alex had changed all of that, pulling her into a world of uncertainty and passion. He had made her question everything she thought she knew about love, about herself, and about what she truly wanted. But now, as she sat alone, the weight of the past few days settled over her like a heavy blanket. She could still feel the warmth of his touch, the tenderness in his words, but now there was doubt creeping in. Was she ready for this? Was she ready for the life that Alex's proposal had promised? Could she truly live in this world, where every moment was a delicate balance between love and duty, between her own desires and the expectations of the world around her? Her mind raced back to the moment in the ballroom, when Alex had knelt before her, in front of so many people. The room had been filled with laughter, cheers, and the clinking of glasses, but in that instant everything had felt silent. The weight of the ring in his hand had been almost symbolic, like a promise that she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. She had said yes, but now that she was alone with her thoughts, the gravity of it all seemed overwhelming. What had led them here? How had it gone from a simple act of kindness, from the casual way he had been there for her, to this, engaged with an entire future ahead of them? Sarah had never been one for fairy tales, never believed in the notion of destiny or soulmates. Life to her had always been about hard work, dedication, and keeping her emotions in check. But now, standing at the edge of this new chapter, she couldn't help but wonder if everything she had believed in was being tested. She had tried to convince herself that she could walk away, that she could leave all of this behind and go back to the life she knew. But deep inside, she knew that wasn't possible. Alex had shown her a side of herself she didn't know existed. He had made her feel things she didn't know she was capable of feeling. Things like vulnerability, like desire, like hope. He had made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she could let go of the tightly held walls she had built around herself. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Alex. "I need to see you. Can we talk?" A shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't explain it, but every time she saw his name on her phone, her heart raced. It wasn't just the excitement of being with him, it was the fear of what it all meant. Was this the calm before the storm? Was she about to have her heart ripped apart by the very man she had just promised to spend the rest of her life with? Or was this the beginning of something real, something that could withstand the test of time? She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and responded, "I'll be there in an hour." The hour passed too quickly. Before Sarah knew it, she found herself walking into Smith Global's towering building, her footsteps echoing on the polished floors. It felt like she was walking into the unknown, as if everything she had known, everything she had built, had been leading her to this moment. She stepped into the elevator, her reflection staring back at her in the shiny metal doors. For the first time in a long while, she didn't recognize the woman she saw there. As the elevator ascended, her mind raced once again. What was Alex thinking? What was he about to say? Her palms grew sweaty, and her heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what kind of future they could have, what kind of life they could build together. They were from different worlds after all. She was a simple assistant, a woman with a past she tried to forget, and Alex was the CEO, the face of Smith Global, a man whose life had been meticulously crafted for success, power, and control. Could someone like her really belong in his world? Could they make this work? The elevator dinged as it reached the top floor, and the doors slid open. Sarah walked down the long corridor, each step taking her closer to the unknown. When she reached Alex's office, she knocked once, the sound echoing in the stillness. The door creaked open, and there he was, standing tall, his dark eyes locked on hers, filled with a warmth that seemed to reach out to her. "Sarah," he said softly, stepping aside to let her in. "I'm glad you came." She entered the office, feeling the weight of his gaze on her. He closed the door behind them, and for a moment there was only silence between them. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the evening light, the city stretching out below them like a sea of stars. "I've been thinking about us," Alex said, his voice steady but filled with a vulnerability Sarah hadn't expected. "About everything." Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. "What about it?" Alex moved closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know this is all happening so fast," he continued, his voice quieter now. "But I want you to know something. I'm not just asking you to marry me because of what we've been through. I'm asking because I want to build a life with you. A real life. Not one of obligation, not one dictated by expectations, but one where we choose each other every day." His words hit her like a wave, crashing into her heart, leaving her breathless. For so long she had been running from the truth of her feelings, afraid to let go of her control, afraid of the unknown. But now, in this moment, everything seemed clear. She didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to know how it would all turn out. What she needed was to trust the journey, to trust him, to trust herself. Sarah looked up at him. Her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, fear, hope, longing, and finally she spoke. I don't know what the future holds, Alex, but I know this: I don't want to walk through it without you. Alex's expression softened, and without another word, he reached out, taking her hand in his. The touch was gentle yet filled, with the promise of something deeper, something real. In that moment, Sarah knew that they were no longer just two people caught in a whirlwind of emotions. They were two souls bound together by a shared destiny, ready to face whatever came next, hand in hand, and for the first time Sarah felt at peace. Whatever happened, whatever obstacles they would face them together. She didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to know everything. All she needed was him, and in that she found the courage to embrace the future that awaited them both. Let's start this journey, she whispered, her voice barely audible. And as Alex smiled, a smile that reached deep into his eyes, Sarah knew that their story was just beginning. Sarah's journey with Alex was one of self-discovery, vulnerability, and ultimately love. From their first unexpected meeting to the moment she said yes to his proposal, Sarah found herself questioning everything she had known about life and love. Alex, the cold, calculated CEO who had initially seemed so distant, gradually revealed a softer side that made Sarah realize that sometimes the most profound connections are the ones that challenge our preconceived notions. Through their ups and downs, Sarah learned that love isn't about perfection, but about embracing imperfections and growing together. It wasn't just a romantic whirlwind that captured her heart. It was the realization that true love requires trust, patience, and a willingness to take risks. In the end, Sarah chose to step into the unknown, letting go of her fears and embracing the journey with Alex. Lesson learned. The story teaches us that life is unpredictable, and love often arrives when we least expect it. The most meaningful relationships are built on understanding, vulnerability, and mutual respect. It's essential to trust in the process, to allow ourselves to be vulnerable, and to embrace the beauty of imperfection. No one has all the answers, but taking that leap of faith can lead to unexpected and beautiful outcomes. Question: what do you think is the most important thing for a relationship to succeed? A. Trust and communication. B. Perfection and control. Comment your answer below with A or B and let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more exciting stories that will keep you hooked.